Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this episode of Threat Talk. I'm your host, Bob Hansmann, and today's episode is about celebrating May Day in the Anywhere workplace. I'd thought of trying to tie it to Star Wars and the whole May the 4th be with you concept, but unfortunately, we are talking about a survey that was conducted on workplace changes going on right now. So while May Day goes back centuries as a celebration of spring, it took on new meaning as part of the whole 19th century labor movement for workers' rights. And so we're seeing right now a long-term shift in workplace rights and practices. And we saw that fueled by response to a current survey that was conducted. So we're going to tie this a little bit to the pandemic because it is a driving force. But I want to make clear this is not an episode about how to respond to COVID-19. We're all past that. It's been done to death. I think, we're just hearing the same thing over and over. So today we're going to be talking about survey data that was collected from security leaders around the world about how this is affecting their long-term business and security strategies. Now, to help us do that, we've invited the founder and president of Osterman Research, Michael Osterman, to be with us. Welcome, Michael.
Bob, it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me here today.
I'm glad to have you here. And I wanted to thank you for specifically helping us dig into this topic. I mean, we've got your survey report, but Osterman has been doing a lot of research of this kind over the last year, correct?
Correct. Yeah, we've done a lot of research. We did a big research project early on in the pandemic, really to find out how organizations were responding early on. But then we've done a lot of research since, asking questions about security, archiving, content management, how organizations are doing encryption, really trying to understand how decision makers are sort of feeling their way through the pandemic, because this is really uncharted territory for most of them.
Oh, yeah, definitely. There's the guesswork on the whole security side of things, but there's also the how workers are changing and some of the stuff that you found there. Because now your group conducted a survey for us for Infoblox called the Global Quest for Sustainable Work from Anywhere Security. So by the way, if any of the listeners want to see the report, you can find that on the Infoblox website and download it. It's got all the wonderful details just listed under white papers under the resources. But Michael, can you share the scope and methodology that you use to ensure that these results were actually meaningful?
Sure. We did a little over 400 surveys. We did 100 in EMEA, 100 in APAC, and about 200 in North America. And what we wanted to do was talk to people in a security role. This was not a typical just open the survey to anybody who wants to take it. These were qualified people that we qualified and ensured that really understand security in the organization. They manage it on a daily basis, and they're familiar with the nuts and bolts of how security is managed in the organization, what they've been doing to address security, the new technologies they've implemented, the problems they've had, and so forth. So we talked to really very qualified people to understand really what was going on. And these were larger organizations. We didn't want to talk to necessarily just small mom and pop organizations. We wanted to talk mainly to very large organizations. So we had,
and from what I saw, these are people kind of leading the charge, people that were the first ones to cut their teeth on how to solve these problems.
Very much so. Yeah, these were big companies that were dealing with the problem.
Okay. Now, you asked them questions not just about how they did their response to COVID, but over several periods. You want to explain what those were?
Sure. What we wanted to do was really to find out what was happening with their response to COVID. We wanted to find out sort of the before state, looking back to about November of 2019, before any of this got started, looking at it early in the pandemic, later on in the pandemic, around the October timeframe. And then we asked them to forecast out, post-COVID-19, what did they expect was going to happen? So we wanted to compare, how they were going to be managing security, what percentage of their workforce was going to be remote, and so forth across those 4 time periods. So we got basically a before, during, and after picture.
Yeah, and I to kind of size the problem for the audience here, I want to be real clear that one of the first things that stood out, it was one of your earlier questions, was when you asked them what their expectations were in a post-COVID world for remote workers, it was about double. They're expecting a major increase in remote workforce, even in a post-COVID world.
Very much so. Yeah. Basically, we saw this huge expansion of remote work, with the vast majority of workers working remotely. And many are now going back to the office, and many more will go back. But we're finding that remote work is pretty much here to stay. particularly if you look at companies like Google, Salesforce, lots of others. They've announced that remote work is going to be the norm, and going into the office is going to be the exception in many cases. So I think remote work is with us now for many, many years to come.
Yeah, and I'm seeing that driven from a lot of different areas. I remember back in December, there was an article in CFO magazine where financial leaders were starting to push for a larger remote workforce because, there's the economy of scale kind of thing, but there were just a lot of business and financial benefits to doing this. And it seems that now that we've been forced to do it, a lot of the fears people had about, but this is, stuff that's going to happen if you start getting them out from under your, constant supervision. None of that came to light. So, we're just seeing that there's a lot of value in going remote. Even our own company has just moved to a new headquarters, reducing our footprint significantly as far as office space goes.
Yeah, and I think that's, it takes a different management style. Instead of evaluating how somebody schmoozes around a water cooler, you evaluate them based on milestones of the work they're actually getting done. And I think companies have adapted pretty well to that. They've understood that manage people, based on the volume of work, the milestones they hit, and so forth. And that's, I think it's in terms of management style and productivity, we're seeing some real benefits. And as the article noted, I mean, there were, major benefits around reduced real estate costs because now you have, smaller offices and so forth. And all of that goes right to the bottom line and has, some significant impacts.
Yeah, I just imagine measuring people based on the quality of their work and not on all that other stuff. So now, moving on, again, to give context to the rest of the data, the post-COVID-19 response is important for that, giving them a foundation. So for the most part, people talk about how hard or painful it was when the pandemic hit, and where everybody was scrambling to a work from home environment, overnight. But your survey asked some more details about where they felt that pain. Where did the company suffer in that transition?
Yeah, I think, a lot of it was the fact that it happened so suddenly. We saw organizations had to scramble, in many cases in 24 or 36 hours to get people, up and running. So they even had to do basic things like get them laptops, get them desktop computers, and so forth. But the organization suffered most trying to maintain their existing services and capabilities or expanding digital transformation projects. Digital transformation took a temporary hit, for the first couple of months as a lot of those initiatives were set aside. And then all of a sudden they ramped back up again as organizations realized they needed to do digital transformation and to do it really well to enable new business models for customers, for their supply chain, for employees, and so forth. And it was, there were a lot of issues around compliance and so forth, but, organizations pretty quickly adapted to the new paradigm.
Yeah, and the report highlights that those two areas, the maintaining existing services and expanding digital transformation, that's where most organizations globally really felt the pain. But also in that data, there were some significant regional variations across some of the other areas of impact, such as compliance.
Very much so, yeah. While the global average numbers might have been close to what we expected, it was kind of surprising to see some of what the regional differences were. Almost half of the organizations in EMEA suffered in trying to maintain existing service or support their digital transformation projects. About twice as many APAC organizations reported challenges with privacy compliance than with those in EMEA. And part of that is that EMEA has been more focused, particularly Western Europe has been more focused on privacy
GDPR
for many years.
Yeah.
Yeah, because GDPR and going back to the data protection statutes from the late 90s and so forth.
Yeah.
And almost 3 times as many North American organizations struggled with industry compliance compared to EMEA. And again, that's because North American organizations don't have that sort of culture of compliance that we find in Western Europe or other parts of the world.
Yeah, and that was one of the things I really liked about your report is that in all this data, you didn't just do global averages. You were able to drill into some of the regional variations because businesses don't work the way everywhere. Even just like, doing video conferencing, I notice when I'm video conferencing with a large group in Asia, they almost always keep their cameras off. When I go to Europe, there's always the cameras on. There's social and other things behind all this. And we got to realize that security doesn't work in a vacuum. It's part of the way your business and people work. So But the good news is, going on to some of the other data, is that you found that most of the organizations actually saw some improvement to their security as a result of how they responded to COVID.
Very much so. About half saw only minor improvements, to be sure, but 47% of those we surveyed saw significant or major improvement. So, they were able to hit the ground, running fairly quickly in many cases, and really develop much better security protocols, implement better security technologies, and so forth.
And I was surprised that this wasn't just about, remote worker security, which obviously went up, but those same changes actually improved their regular mobile force, the salespeople and others who have to travel as part of their job. I used to be one of those road warriors and what the survey didn't capture is I bet they were actually even more productive, because I remember as a road warrior, there were things I couldn't do when I was traveling, because in order to be safe, oh no, you got to be on the network to do that. But they didn't have that excuse. So they raised security, improved productivity, and the report shows that even in office security went up.
Absolutely. We found that about 1 in 4 believe their in-office security is actually better today than it was pre-COVID. So we've seen, a lot of spillover effects, and many of those have been very positive.
So why do you think that is?
Well, the survey was focused on long-term security strategy, so it didn't really go into much detail on the short-term COVID response. We wanted to look at what the impact was going to be over the long term. But you can imagine that IT and security teams really benefited from the emergency budget allocations and approval process that was likely shortened or eliminated in a lot of organizations. Organizations had to scramble, and so it was much easier to get things approved and to get them approved very quickly. So it's probable that security teams were able to make more than a few changes to their security posture overall. They were able to do some of the things maybe that they had wanted to do all along, but never really had the budget for.
Yeah, things that they just, couldn't get that last vote on the board or something to give them the money.
Yeah, very much so.
All right. Now, another thing that the survey revealed was that a lot of the companies in their response turned to VPN.
Yeah, very much so.
Today, so you'll have to read between the lines.
Yeah, well, only 37% used VPN before COVID. That jumped to 65% by April. So we saw this massive shift to VPN because people understood that VPN was valuable, but they really had to use it, as you suddenly had tens of millions of workers working from home, and VPN use has stayed steady with 63% of the workforce using VPN as of the October-November timeframe when we did the survey. However, their response in the survey indicates that they expect to reduce their dependency on VPN in a post-COVID world. They're actually going to be using it less than they were, right in the midst of the pandemic itself.
But going back to why they turned to it early on, was it just because they had the license for it?
I think that's part of it. VPN was there; it was available. I think it's really a safe choice, and they needed to minimize risk. They needed something to be able to allow people to communicate more securely. When they were remote, there were enough unknowns in the mix trying to shift a huge population off network while ensuring productivity, maintaining security levels, and so forth. And it really wasn't easy for everyone to do this, but at least they didn't have to learn a new security solution overnight in parallel with all of these other massive changes that were going on with their people, with their processes, with dealing with, how customers, supply chains were working, and so forth.
Yeah, it's funny how today it's still so true that whenever you buy a security solution, it normally creates a few other problems. So yeah, nobody really wants to have to get something new. So I guess using what they already had, what they already knew, made that safe. But the survey does call out that they're not all satisfied with VPN.
That's correct. Yeah, a lot of that has to do with the scale of the deployment and what remote workers are able to do remotely. So, I think, that was a big part of it. We had never really used VPN on this kind of a scale, and so suddenly before.
Yeah, I mean, because again, when I was a road warrior, I remember having to call somebody back at the office to run up a report or look up something. But having a VPN would have allowed me to do that. But it still wasn't the same thing as being in the office. VPN didn't always work the way it was supposed to.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Yeah. And COVID not only necessitated a larger number of remote workers, but expanded the list of things they had to do remotely. And that drove the need to do data and processes that really had never been exposed in this way before. So, for a lot of organizations, it was really very, very new territory for them.
So VPN was obviously a logical choice, again, a safe choice. But why are they now looking at alternatives?
Well, in this case, there wasn't really one thing that stood out as a reason for them to reduce their dependence on VPN. We found really a variety of things. But the survey uncovered a lot of challenges that organizations encounter using VPN. For example, 15% complained that their users found using VPN to be a hassle. If you've ever used VPN, and depending upon the solution you use, it can be pretty slow and dramatically reduce performance on your system. 10% reported that setting VPN up was a hassle. Another 10% said that maintaining it was a hassle. So a lot of the discontent is around this quote unquote hassle. VPN just doesn't seem that easy to deploy, use, or maintain. We found also in the survey that another 1 out of 7 organizations, or 14%, complained about connectivity issues like dropped connections, which can be fairly common with VPN. And there were other responses, including, the old reliable, it costs too much response from about 7% of organizations.
Yeah, and I suppose with the shift to cloud, some of this is getting a little bit easier, which is where the survey kind of went next. So with that being a concern, what applications are they using or budgeting to deal with this long-term remote workforce? VPN's only acceptable as a short-term for a lot of them. So let's go over my favorite part of your survey about, what solutions do they think could replace their dependence on VPN? And of course, you even go into what ones they're using today and where the money is actually going to be spent. But, let's take a look. What were the technologies they're evaluating?
Well, the survey asked about 18 different security technologies. Basically, we gave people a laundry list of things they could choose from. So a lot more that we can go into here. And none of those are really a direct replacement for VPN itself. But the top 3 technologies that really could reduce their dependence on VPN are, first, endpoint. I apologize for my cough here. Just getting over a cold.
Those are happening these days, I hear.
First was endpoint antivirus or anti-malware. Second was DNS security. And third was identity and access management, or IAM. And each of those technologies was chosen by about half of all the respondents we spoke to.
Okay, so that's ones that they think could actually be a replacement. But which of those, what are they using today?
Well, what's interesting is that the same 3 came out on top in terms of what they're using today: endpoint antivirus, DNS security, and identity and access management. But secure email gateways came out a very close 4th.
That was interesting. Yeah, and I did recall quite a few. But your top 3 or 4, I noticed, those have big numbers, and then everything else dropped really down. So these were pretty definitive findings. And that was also very interesting for me, particularly, and I would think anybody on our listening audience who's responsible for making budget decisions. There's some pretty clear guidance, so you can see what your peers are doing. But where are they investing? And that goes to that budget thing. A lot of people will say, "Oh yeah, I would do this if I was you." And then if you ask them where they're going to spend the money, well, I would do this other thing. So let's get down to the truth. Where are they actually looking to spend money?
Well, of those 3 that I've just mentioned, only DNS security is expected to see some real investment, with 26% of respondents saying they're going to be investing there. CASB, Cloud Access Security Broker, was number 1 with 32%, and that was followed by Next Generation Firewalls with 22%.
Yeah, and I saw those numbers, and it was kind of interesting because, like you said, of the top 3 that they said they're using, DNS security is the only one that they're going to invest more in significantly. But then I added up where they're going to spend and where they've already spent, the stuff they've got and the other. And when I look at that, it came up to, let's see here. Looks like the number 1 is DNS security. 87% of respondents either own or are going to invest in security solutions. Endpoint antivirus or malware. That's number 2. I was really surprised. I would expect they'd already have a big investment, but indeed, again, what they own and where they're investing, 78%. And then CASB, which didn't come up in the first 2 lists as a top 3 or even a top 4. This one comes in as a solid 3rd place. It looks like CASB's day has finally come. Everybody's been talking about that for a while, and finally, it looks like they're going to put some money into CASB because they're moving to the cloud. I take it. If you're going to have your employees everywhere, why have everybody backhaul to the home office?
Very much so.
Make sense to you, by the way? did my math, did I violate anything in your survey by adding
No,
those?
not at all. Basically, within the margins of error, you're right on.
Cool. And now, so to be clear, there are other things outside of this survey that are helping organizations evolve. You and I did a webinar where we got some Q&A earlier when the report first came out. Now, some of the companies are shifting to the cloud services, which we talked about. They don't need a VPN for that because they're using a browser with HTTPS. They're getting their encryption in another way. So they were already doing some things that were reducing their dependence on VPN. But there are still other reasons where VPN, is still going to be a valid solution.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And we're not saying that VPN is being replaced. It's not going away. We're going to continue to see VPN used for many, many years to come. The survey only basically told us that a lot of organizations are looking to reduce their dependence on VPN by investing in other solutions. But it's really going to be a whole panoply of solutions, not really a wholesale replacement of VPN by any means.
Yeah, I still get a little bit of a shock when I look at what we've got, in our portfolios today, because I started in this business when the only things you could buy, in addition to what came with your operating system, was desktop antivirus. They didn't have it for servers, and a firewall. Those are the only two security products we had back in, when I first got exposed to this. And today I talk to customers who say they're dealing with 20 or 30 different vendors of products, and for each one of those vendors they've got multiple products. It's just really it's a mess to try and track all of this, but I've only used VPN a handful of times myself, so yeah, it's in the last year for my job. Most everything's in the cloud. But we've skipped across the report, just cover some of the highlights here because of our trying to keep these podcasts short and consumable for our listeners. But do you have any parting thoughts for our listeners about other things that that you think are worthwhile noting?
Well, I mean, as you've noted, security really is very much an ongoing process. You don't just respond to COVID and then move on. Security is always a moving target. As you've noted, I mean, back in the old days, we had a very simple security infrastructure. Now we have very sophisticated adversaries. And so it really is very much a moving target, and it requires continual adaptation to new and changing conditions. We saw a big hit from COVID. Organizations had to respond very quickly and had to do a lot of things that they hadn't done before. But we should just expect more of that in the future. Security continues to be this sort of ongoing process that's going to have to get better and better.
Yeah, it's it's a moving target, and we've got new technologies coming out. Companies are making their choices and shifts on browsers. Even we've got dot and doe technologies that are coming out and impacting things. The technology landscape is changing, if not almost as fast, almost the same as the threat landscape. You're getting hit from both sides, so security becomes a constant juggling act. So really appreciate you being with us today, Michael. I'm sure we'll have you on in the future again.
Bob, it was a real pleasure. Thank you so much for having me today.
All right. And I want to thank to all of our listeners and viewers, if you're watching the live stream. Join us next time as we continue our efforts to help you stay on top of cybersecurity and ahead of cyber risk on Threat Talk.